The moment Marcus agreed to be Riley's fake boyfriend for her sister's wedding weekend, he never imagined he'd find himself standing in a hotel bathroom at 2 in the morning, staring at his reflection and wondering when the pretending had stopped feeling like pretending. His hands gripped the marble countertop as he tried to steady his breathing, tried to convince himself that the way his heart had lurched when she'd fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder during the reception was just exhaustion, just the champagne, just anything other than what it actually was. But he knew the truth. Somewhere between the rehearsal dinner jokes and the slow dance they'd shared under fairy lights, somewhere between her nervous laughter and the way she intertwined her fingers with his like it was the most natural thing in the world, he had crossed a line he'd promised himself he wouldn't cross. He had caught feelings for a woman who was only pretending to love him. It had started 3 weeks earlier, in the cramped break room of the advertising firm where they both worked. Riley had been crying, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her phone clutched in her trembling hand. Marcus had known her for 2 years, admired her from a distance, watched her date other men who never seemed to appreciate the way she lit up when she talked about her ideas or how she always remembered everyone's coffee order. They were friendly, the kind of coworkers who chatted by the water cooler and sometimes grabbed lunch in the same group, but nothing more. Yet when he'd seen her falling apart that afternoon, something in him couldn't just walk away. She'd explained everything through broken sobs and hiccuping breaths. Her younger sister Emma was getting married in 3 weeks, a fairy tale wedding that had been planned for over a year. Riley had RSVP'd with a +1 back when she'd been dating Derek, a relationship everyone in her family had loved, a relationship her mother had been convinced would lead to Riley's own wedding. But Derek had ended things 2 months ago, leaving Riley heartbroken and humiliated. She couldn't face her family's pitying looks, couldn't endure her mother's disappointed sighs, couldn't bear being the only single person at a wedding where even her divorced uncle was bringing a date. She needed someone to pretend, just for one weekend, that she was happy and loved and moving on with her life. Few believe in second chances, in unexpected love, and in the courage it takes to be vulnerable. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us continue bringing you stories that touch the heart. Marcus had said yes before he could overthink it. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him with those desperate, hopeful eyes. Maybe it was because he'd always wondered what it would be like to be close to her, even if it was just pretend. Maybe it was because somewhere deep in his carefully guarded heart, he'd been a little bit in love with Riley Mitchell since the first time she'd defended his campaign idea in a meeting when everyone else had doubted him. They'd spent the next 2 weeks preparing, creating a believable backstory about how they'd started dating 6 months ago, how he asked her out after a late night working on a project together, how they'd kept it quiet at work to maintain professionalism. She'd shown him pictures of her family, warned him about her mother's invasive questions and her father's protective nature, coached him on inside jokes and family dynamics. They'd practiced holding hands, practiced the casual touches that couples shared, practiced looking at each other like they were in love. What Riley didn't know was that for Marcus, very little of it was actually practice. The wedding weekend had begun on a Friday afternoon when they'd driven together to the resort 3 hours. Outside the city, Riley had been nervous, her leg bouncing anxiously as she sat in the passenger seat, going over their story one more time. Marcus had reached over and placed his hand on her knee, stilling her movement, and said something that surprised even himself. He'd told her to stop worrying, to just be herself, and that he'd follow her lead. He'd told her that anyone who knew her would see how incredible she was, relationship or not. She'd looked at him then with an expression he couldn't quite read, something soft and questioning, before squeezing his hand and looking away. Meeting her family had been overwhelming in the best possible way. Her mother was warm but scrutinizing, her father was gruff but kind, and her sister Emma was a whirlwind of bridal excitement who barely paid attention to anything beyond her own upcoming nuptials. Riley's extended family was huge, loud, and full of love, and Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying their company. But what surprised him most was how natural it felt to play the role of Riley's boyfriend. when he wrapped his arm around her waist during family photos, when he pressed a kiss to her temple while her aunt told an embarrassing childhood story, when he defended her choice of career to a judgmental cousin. None of it felt like acting. It felt like stepping into a life he hadn't known he wanted. The rehearsal dinner had been when things started to shift. Riley had been seated next to her ex-boyfriend Derek, who had shown up as a groomsman, something she apparently hadn't known until that evening. Marcus had watched the color drain from her face when Derek walked in, had felt her hand tighten around his under the table. Derek was everything Marcus wasn't: tall, classically handsome, confident in a way that bordered on arrogance. He'd barely acknowledged Riley's presence until the speeches began, and then he'd caught Marcus's eye with a smirk that said he knew exactly what was happening, that he could see through. Their charade. During the toasts, when Emma had mentioned how happy she was that Riley had found someone who appreciated her, Derek had laughed quietly, and something protective and fierce had ignited in Marcus's chest. When Riley had excused herself to the bathroom, Marcus had followed her, finding her leaning against the wall in the hallway, fighting back tears. She'd apologized for dragging him into this mess, for asking him to pretend, for not warning him about Derek. But Marcus had stepped closer, had cupped her face in his hands, and had told her something that was absolutely, terrifyingly true. He'd told her that Derek was an idiot for letting her go, that any man who couldn't see her worth didn't deserve a second of her time, and that spending this weekend with her hadn't felt like a favor or an obligation. It had felt like a privilege. She'd stared at him, her eyes wide and searching, and for a moment he'd thought she might kiss him. Instead, she'd whispered a thank you and taken his hand, and they'd walked back into the dinner together, her head held higher than before. The wedding ceremony itself had been beautiful, but Marcus had barely watched the bride and groom. He'd been too aware of Riley sitting beside him, of the way she'd cried during the vows, of how she'd gripped his hand when the couple had exchanged rings. During the reception, they danced and laughed and talked to relatives, and with each passing hour, Marcus had felt himself sinking deeper into something he couldn't control. When a slow song had played and he'd pulled her close, when she'd rested her head against his chest and sighed contentedly, when he'd breathed in the scent of her perfume and felt her heartbeat against his, he'd realized with startling clarity that he didn't want this weekend to end. He didn't want to go back to being just coworkers who occasionally had lunch together. He didn't want to pretend that holding her didn't feel like coming home. Later that night, after Riley had fallen asleep from exhaustion and emotion, Marcus had carefully extracted himself and ended up in that bathroom, confronting the truth he'd been avoiding. He was in love with her, completely, undeniably, terrifyingly in love with a woman who had hired him to play a part. And the worst part was that he had no idea if anything she'd felt this weekend had been real, or if she'd just been an incredibly convincing actress. Every touch, every smile, every moment of intimacy could have been part of the performance, and he had no way of knowing the difference. He'd returned to the bed, careful not to wake her, and had laid there in the darkness, memorizing the sound of her breathing, preparing himself for the inevitable return to reality. Tomorrow they'd drive back to the city, and on Monday they'd go back to work, and this would all be over. She'd thank him probably, laugh about how well they'd pulled it off, and he'd have to pretend that his heart wasn't breaking. He'd have to pretend that he hadn't spent the best weekend of his life living a lie. So, this story has touched your heart in any way. If you've ever loved someone you thought you couldn't have, or if you believe that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places, please show your support by liking this video, leaving a comment, sharing your thoughts, and sharing this with someone who needs to feel something beautiful today. The next morning had been quiet as they'd packed their bags and said goodbye to Riley's family. Her mother had hugged Marcus tightly and whispered that she was glad Riley had found him. Her father had shaken his hand and told him to take care of his daughter. Emma had thanked him for making her sister smile again. Each goodbye had felt like a small knife to his heart because he knew they were saying goodbye to a version of him that didn't really exist, to a relationship that was about to dissolve the moment they got back in the car. But then something unexpected had happened. As they'd loaded their bags into the trunk, as Marcus had opened the passenger door for Riley one last time, she'd stopped him. She'd stood there in the parking lot, the morning sun catching in her hair, and she'd asked him a question that changed everything. She'd asked him if any of it had felt real to him, If he'd felt what she'd felt, if somewhere between the pretending and the performing, they'd stumbled into something true. Marcus had frozen, his heart pounding so hard he was certain she could hear it. He'd searched her face for any sign of what answer she wanted, but all he'd seen was vulnerability and hope and fear that mirrored his own. So he'd taken a breath and decided that after a weekend of pretending, he was done with lies. He'd told her everything. He'd told her that he'd been half in love with her long before she'd ever asked for his help, that this weekend hadn't been acting for him, that every touch and every word had been real and terrifying and more honest than anything he'd ever done. He'd told her that he understood if she didn't feel the same way, that he'd still be her friend and her coworker and would never make things awkward, but that he couldn't spend one more second pretending that his feelings were fake. Riley had started crying then, but they weren't sad tears. She'd laughed through them, had reached up and pulled his face down to hers, and had kissed him with a passion and certainty that answered every question he'd been afraid to ask. When they'd finally pulled apart, she'd told him that she'd been terrified all weekend, that she was the only one feeling something real, that she'd caught herself forgetting they were pretending, that the moments that had scared her most were the ones where being with him had felt like the most natural thing in the world. If you believe their story deserves a happy ending, comment real love below before you finish reading. They'd stood in that parking lot for another 20 minutes, holding each other and laughing and talking about all the moments over the past 2 years when they'd almost said something, almost taken a chance, almost been brave enough to risk what they had for the possibility of something more. They talked about how Marcus had noticed that Riley always wore the same earrings on important presentation days, and how Riley had realized that Marcus always made sure she had a seat in crowded meetings. They'd shared all the small observations and quiet longings that had built up between them, creating a foundation neither had realized was there. The drive home had been different than the drive there. Instead of nervous preparation, there had been excitement and possibility. Instead of practiced responses, there had been honest conversation about what they wanted, about how to navigate dating while working together, about introducing this new reality to their colleagues and her family as something that had genuinely developed. They'd made plans for a real first date, laughed about how they'd technically already met each other's families, and talked about taking things at whatever pace felt right now, that they didn't have to pretend anymore. What had started as a desperate favor, as a weekend of fake smiles and rehearsed affection, had become the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Marcus had agreed to be Riley's pretend boyfriend for a wedding weekend, but somewhere between the champagne toasts and the slow dances, somewhere between meeting her family and defending her worth, somewhere between the performance and the truth, he'd become something else entirely. He'd become the man who loved her openly, honestly, and without reservation. And she'd become the woman brave enough to love him back. Sometimes the best love stories begin with pretending, but they only become real when someone has the courage to stop acting and start feeling. Their fake relationship had given them permission to be close, but it was there, real feelings that had given them the courage to stay,